I was watering my roses when my phone exploded with debit alerts. $347, $892, $275. All charges I never made. My daughter had access to my account, but these weren't groceries or gas. These were bridal shops, fancy restaurants, photography services. When I called to ask about her engagement dinner, Sarah's voice turned ice cold. "Oh, we had it yesterday. You weren't invited." 23,000 of my retirement money, spent on a party designed to exclude me. They thought they were so clever, using my card while cutting me out. But when the police called my daughter for questioning, her voice wasn't so confident anymore. "Stay with me. This gets much worse." The buzzing wouldn't stop. I counted 7 distinct vibrations before I finally wiped my hands on the old towel I kept hanging from the garden shed and walked over to check. My phone screen was lit up like a Christmas tree. Debit alert after debit alert, each one accompanied by that familiar ping that meant money leaving my account. Nordstrom, $347. Sephora, $128. Someplace called Blush Bridal Boutique, $892. Each notification had a timestamp within the last 2 hours, and each one made my stomach tighten just a little more. I'd made my daughter Sarah an authorized user on my debit card 3 years ago, back when she was between jobs and struggling to make rent. She'd promised it was temporary, just until she got back on her feet. That was $15,000 ago. But who's counting? I sat down on the wooden bench I'd built myself last spring, the one that overlooked the rose bed where my ex-wife used to complain about the thorns getting caught in her stockings. The irony wasn't lost on me now. I opened my banking app and scrolled through the day's transactions, each one a small puncture wound in my retirement savings. Hair salon, $275. Something called glamour nails, $85. A restaurant I'd never heard of, $156. I tried to do the math in my head, but the numbers kept swimming around like they do when you're trying not to think about what they really mean. My daughter was getting married in 6 weeks, and apparently she was funding the entire event with my money. The strange part was, I hadn't even met her fiancé yet. Every time I asked about him, she'd change the subject or suddenly remember somewhere she needed to be. I looked back at the roses, their bright faces turning toward the setting sun, and tried to remember the last time Sarah and I had a real conversation. Not the hurried phone calls where she needed something, or the brief visits where she'd grab whatever she came for and leave. A real conversation. The kind where we actually looked each other in the eye and talked about things that mattered. I couldn't remember, and that realization sat heavy in my chest like a stone. I placed the phone face down on the bench and went back to my roses, pretending I could water away the growing unease that had started to bloom alongside him. The David Austins. The next morning, I was cleaning my gardening tools in the garage when I heard the front door open without so much as a knock. No doorbell, no "hello, Dad," just the distinct sound of Sarah's heels clicking across my hardwood floor like she owned the place. I set down the pruning shears I'd been oiling and walked inside to find her standing in my kitchen, examining her reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator door. She was wearing a short silk robe that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. Her hair teased up into one of those elaborate styles that take hours to achieve. Her eyelashes so thick with mascara they cast shadows on her cheeks. Her nails were glossy and sharp, painted the color of fresh blood, and she was holding one of those oversized iced lattes that cost $8 and taste like sugar with a hint of coffee. The cup was sweating in the morning heat, dripping condensation onto the stack of mail I'd left on the counter. "Morning, sweetheart," I said, though it came out sounding more like a question than a greeting. She glanced at me in the refrigerator's reflection, but didn't turn around, just continued applying another coat of lip gloss with the same precision a surgeon might use to make an incision. The silence stretched between us like a rubber band about to snap, filled with the sound of her breathing and the soft pop of her lips as she pressed them together. I cleared my throat and tried again. "You're up early for a Saturday." She finally turned, and I caught a whiff of her perfume, something expensive and cloying that made my eyes water slightly. Her makeup was flawless, every line and shade perfectly applied, but there was something cold in her expression that made her look like a beautiful mannequin. "I need more money," she said, as casually as she might comment on the weather. No preamble, no small talk, just straight to the point with the kind of directness that might have been admirable if it weren't so calculating. I opened my mouth to ask what for, but she was already reaching into her designer purse, another purchase I'd probably financed without knowing it, and pulling out her phone. She showed me a screenshot of some wedding dress, all lace and beading and probably worth more than my car, and I felt that familiar tightness in my chest that came whenever money was involved. The final fitting is Monday, and then there's the shoes, the hair trial, the makeup artist. She trailed off, scrolling through what looked like an endless list of expenses, each one more extravagant than the last. I walked over to the stove where I'd been making my Saturday morning meatballs, the same recipe my mother had taught me 50 years ago. The tomato sauce was simmering, filling the kitchen with the smell of garlic and basil, and I lifted the lid to stir it, partly to check the consistency, and partly to give my hands something to do. "Stay for lunch," I offered, ladling a small spoonful to taste. "These are almost ready, and I made enough for—" She wrinkled her nose like I'd offered her spoiled milk, taking a step back from the stove as if the smell might contaminate her perfectly applied makeup. "Smells cheap, Dad. Really cheap." The words hit me harder than they should have, considering the source, but I kept stirring, focusing on the rhythmic motion of the wooden spoon against the pot's bottom. "Give me 300, she said, not asked. And when I didn't immediately respond, she added, "Cash? The vendors don't take cards for deposits." I set the spoon down and looked at her. Really looked at her, trying to find some trace of the little girl who used to help me make these same meatballs on Saturday mornings. But all I saw was a stranger wearing my daughter's face, someone who saw me as nothing more than a walking ATM with an endless supply of funds. I reached for my wallet, counted out the bills, and watched her stuff them into her purse with the same casual indifference she might show when disposing of a used tissue. The shirt was still warm from the iron when I picked up my phone to call Sarah. I'd spent 20 minutes pressing out every wrinkle, the steam rising from the cotton like morning mist, because I wanted to look presentable for her engagement dinner. The blue Oxford was my best, the one I wore to AA meetings when they asked me to speak, the one that made me feel like I still had some dignity left. I held it up to the afternoon light streaming through my bedroom window, checking for any missed creases, then laid it carefully across the back of the chair. My black slacks were already hanging in the closet, and I'd polished my dress shoes until they gleamed like dark mirrors. Everything was ready except for one small detail. I didn't know what time to be there. I scrolled through my contacts until I found Sarah's number, my thumb hesitating over the call button for reasons I couldn't quite name. Something felt off, like that moment before a thunderstorm when the air gets thick and electric, but I pushed the feeling down and pressed call. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up, and when she did, there was no warmth in her voice, just that flat, professional tone she used with telemarketers. "What do you want?" she said, not even bothering with a hello. I could hear traffic in the background, the distant hum of car engines and honking horns, like she was walking down a busy street. "I was wondering what I should wear to the engagement dinner," I said, trying to keep my voice light and casual. "I've got my blue shirt ready, but I wasn't sure if it's supposed to be formal or—" She cut me off before I could finish, her voice sharp as a knife blade cutting through paper. What for? The question hung in the air between us like a physical thing, heavy and cold. I felt my grip tighten on the phone, the plastic creaking slightly under the pressure of my fingers. To come to your party, I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth, like I was speaking a foreign language. When is it exactly? I know it's soon, but I don't think you ever gave me the specific time. The silence that followed was so complete, I thought the call might have dropped, but I could still hear the background noise, still hear her breathing on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her words hit me like a physical blow. Oh, we had it yesterday. The shirt slipped from my other hand and fell to the floor in a soft heap of blue cotton. I stared at it lying there, all my careful ironing undone, the fabric already starting to wrinkle where it had folded against itself. The room felt suddenly airless, like someone had sucked all the oxygen out through a straw, and I had to sit down on the edge of my bed to keep from swaying. Yesterday? I repeated, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. You weren't invited, she said, each word precise and deliberate, like she was reading from a script she'd memorized. So of course I didn't tell you. In the background I could hear another voice, my ex-wife Linda, her tone sharp and commanding even though I couldn't make out the specific words. Sarah's voice became muffled as she covered the phone, and I heard snippets of conversation. He's asking about, and just tell him. And Linda's unmistakable laugh, the same bitter sound that had filled our house during the last year of our marriage. Sarah came back on the line, her voice brighter now, almost cheerful. Oh, and Dad? I'll need more money tomorrow. The caterer wants another deposit for the reception, and the florist is being difficult about the centerpieces. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me sitting there with a dead phone in my hand and my best shirt crumpled on the floor like a discarded dream. I walked downstairs to the kitchen, my legs feeling unsteady, like I'd just gotten off a boat after a long voyage. The dinner I'd prepared, leftover meatballs and a simple salad, sat untouched on the counter, the tomato sauce congealed into a thick, unappetizing skin. I couldn't bring myself to eat. Couldn't even bring myself to put the food away. So I just stood there staring at it like it might provide some answers. My phone was still in my hand, warm from my palm and heavy as a stone. And almost without thinking, I opened the social media app I rarely used. The blue icon seemed to mock me as it loaded, its cheerful color at odds with the gray weight settling in my chest. Sarah's profile appeared first in my feed, and there they were, photo after photo from last night's engagement dinner. The restaurant looked expensive, all white tablecloths and soft lighting, the kind of place where the waiters wear bow ties and the wine costs more than my weekly grocery budget. There was Sarah in a dress I'd never seen before, black and elegant, and probably charged to my credit card, her engagement ring catching the camera flash like a tiny star. Her fiancé stood beside her, tall and clean-cut with kind eyes and a nervous smile, his arm around her waist in a way that looked both protective and uncertain. This was the first time I'd seen his face clearly, and he looked younger than I'd expected. Maybe early 30s, with the soft edges of someone who'd never had to fight for anything. I scrolled down and felt the air leave my lungs. There was Linda, my ex-wife, positioned right in the center of the group photo, like she was the mother of the bride already. She was wearing that burgundy dress she'd bought for our 20th anniversary, the one she'd worn exactly once before deciding it made her look old. Her hair was different, shorter and more styled than I remembered, and she was smiling with genuine happiness, the kind of expression I hadn't seen on her face during the last 5 years of our marriage. Her hand was resting on Sarah's shoulder in a gesture of ownership, marking her territory like a cat rubbing against furniture. The other guests were people I recognized. Linda's sister Margaret, who'd never liked me even when we were married, and several of Sarah's college friends whose names I'd never quite learned. There was Sarah's boss from her marketing job, a woman with severe glasses and a practiced corporate smile, and what looked like the fiancé's parents, an older couple dressed in conservative navy blue, who looked as uncomfortable as I felt. Everyone was holding champagne glasses, their faces flushed with alcohol and celebration, and in every single photo, there was an empty space where I should have been standing. I counted 17 photos in total, each one a small knife twist in my chest. Sarah laughing with her head thrown back. The fiancé looking adoringly at his bride-to-be. Linda making a toast, her glass raised high, and her expression triumphant. A group shot of everyone gathered around the happy couple, their faces glowing with joy and expensive wine. Not once did anyone look sad or disappointed about my absence. Not once did anyone seem to notice that the bride's father wasn't there to see his daughter celebrate her engagement. They looked complete without me, like I was just an inconvenient detail they'd successfully edited out of their perfect picture. I set the phone down on the kitchen table and stared at the cold meatballs, my appetite completely gone. The house felt enormous around me, every room echoing with the sound of my own breathing, and I realized with startling clarity that I had no idea who my daughter had become or why she seemed to hate me so much. But I knew one thing for certain. I was going to find out. I made coffee first, strong and black, the way I'd learned to drink it in AA when the meetings ran long and the stories got heavy. My hands were steady as I poured, steam rising from the mug in thin wisps that caught the morning light streaming through the kitchen window. The laptop sat closed on the dining room table like a sleeping animal, waiting for me to wake it up and face whatever truth was hiding in the numbers. I'd learned in recovery that you can't fix what you won't acknowledge, and right now I needed to acknowledge exactly how much money had walked out of my account without my knowledge. The login screen appeared, asking for my password, and I typed it in with 2 fingers, the same methodical hunting and pecking I'd been using since I bought this computer 3 years ago. My account balance loaded slowly, each digit appearing like a countdown to reality, and when the final number settled on the screen, I felt that familiar tightness in my chest. $23,000 less than it should have been, spread across the last 6 months in a pattern of withdrawals and charges that told a story I was only beginning to understand. I reached for the yellow legal pad I kept in the kitchen drawer, the same kind I'd used to track my sobriety milestones, and started writing. March 15th. Nordstrom, $347.82, I wrote, my handwriting careful and precise. March 18th. Sephora, $128.45. March 22nd. Blush Bridal Boutique, $892.16. Each entry was a small wound, but I kept writing, line after line, until the pattern became clear as daylight. The charges had started small, a lunch here, a gas fill-up there, but they'd grown progressively larger as Sarah's wedding date approached. The engagement dinner alone had cost me over $4,000. The restaurant deposit, the flowers, the photographer, even the champagne they'd used to toast her future while excluding me from it. I clicked on each transaction to see the details, screenshots appearing on my screen like evidence photos at a crime scene. The Bella Vista restaurant charge showed a party of 12 with premium wine pairings and a private dining room. The florist had charged for premium white roses and baby's breath centerpieces. Ironic, considering I grew better roses in my own backyard. There was a charge for photography services, professional hair and makeup, even valet parking. Every detail of their perfect evening had been funded by my retirement savings, planned with military precision, and executed without a single word to me. I opened a new document on the laptop and started typing, using the same systematic approach I'd learned in my manufacturing job 40 years ago. Transaction log. Sarah's wedding expenses, I titled it, then began entering each charge with its date, amount, vendor, and description. The numbers told their own story. This wasn't impulsive spending or careless money management. This was deliberate, calculated, and coordinated. Someone had planned this exclusion down to the last champagne flute, and they'd used my money to do it. The coffee had gone cold by the time I finished, but I didn't get up to reheat it. Instead, I sat back in my chair and looked at the spreadsheet I'd created. Rows and columns of financial betrayal laid out as neatly as a funeral arrangement. My AA sponsor had always told me that resentment was like taking poison and expecting the other person to die. But looking at these numbers, I felt something colder than resentment settling in my chest. This wasn't about hurt feelings or family drama anymore. This was about respect, about boundaries, about a daughter who'd chosen to fund her celebration with her father's money while simultaneously choosing to celebrate without him. I saved the document to my desktop and closed the laptop, the screen going dark like a curtain falling on the first act of whatever this was going to become. I started with the restaurant because their charge was the largest single expense, $2,647.63, for what the transaction description called private dining event. The Bella Vista's phone number was listed on their website, along with photos of their elegant dining rooms and testimonials from satisfied customers who'd celebrated life's special moments within their walls. I dialed the number and waited through 3 rings before a professional voice answered. Bella Vista Restaurant, this is Marcus speaking. How may I help you? I'm calling about a private dining event that was charged to my credit card last Tuesday, I said, keeping my voice level and businesslike. I'd like to verify some details about the booking. There was a pause, the sound of fingers clicking on a keyboard, and then Marcus was back. Can you give me the last 4 digits of the card used for the payment? I read them off from my statement, and I heard more clicking, then a longer pause. Yes, I see the booking here. Party of 12 in our sunset room. The reservation was made under the name Sarah Mitchell, and she listed herself as your daughter on the contact form. Is there a problem with the charge? No problem with the charge itself, I said, pulling out my legal pad to take notes. I'm just trying to confirm who made the actual booking. Was it Sarah who called, or did someone else make the reservation? More clicking, and I could almost hear Marcus flipping through paperwork on the other end of the line. Actually, it looks like there were 2 different people who called about this event. The initial reservation was made by a Linda Mitchell. She said she was the mother of the bride and that the bill should go to the father of the bride's card. Then Sarah called later to confirm the menu selections and upgrade the wine package. The pen felt heavy in my hand as I wrote this down, each word like a small nail being driven into something that was already dead. I see. And did Linda Mitchell give you my card information directly? No, sir. She said her daughter would handle the payment details. Sarah called back about an hour later with your card number and authorization code. I could hear the uncertainty creeping into Marcus's voice, the dawning realization that maybe this wasn't a routine billing inquiry. I called 4 more vendors from my list, and the story was the same everywhere. Linda making the initial contact and arrangements, Sarah following up with my payment information, both of them claiming authority to spend my money on an event I wasn't invited to attend. The photographer had been told I was unable to attend due to health issues. The florist had been given explicit instructions that the father won't be coming, so don't worry about a boutonniere. Even the valet service had been told to expect 1 less car than originally planned. The last call I made was to the makeup artist, a woman named Cheryl, who worked out of a high-end salon downtown. Her voice was warm and chatty, the kind of person who probably knew all her clients' personal business and remembered their birthdays. "Oh yes, I remember that event," she said when I explained why I was calling. "Such a lovely girl, your daughter. Though I have to say I was a bit surprised when her mother mentioned you wouldn't be there. Usually the father of the bride wants to be involved in these special moments." She paused, and I could hear hair dryers running in the background. "Between you and me, the mother seemed pretty insistent about keeping things small and intimate. Said something about family dynamics being complicated." I thanked Cheryl and hung up the phone, then sat staring at my notes for a long time. 6 phone calls, 6 different vendors, and the same story everywhere. My ex-wife orchestrating, my daughter executing, and my money paying for a celebration designed specifically to exclude me. But there was something else. Something I'd heard in Cheryl's voice, and in the way Marcus had hesitated when I'd asked about the booking details. They all thought something was wrong too. I chose Murphy's Coffee House because it was neutral territory. Not too upscale for my budget, not too casual for Sarah's image, with small tables tucked into corners where private conversations could stay private. The manila folder sat on the passenger seat of my truck during the drive over, thick with printed bank statements and vendor invoices, each page a question that needed answering. I arrived 15 minutes early and claimed a table near the back window, ordered black coffee, and spread the documents across the scratched wooden surface like a detective laying out evidence at a crime scene. Sarah walked in 20 minutes late, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor in that same purposeful rhythm I'd heard in my kitchen a week ago. She was wearing a cream-colored blazer over dark jeans, her hair pulled back in a style that probably had a name I'd never learn. And she carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from never doubting you'll get what you want. She spotted me immediately, her eyes narrowing when she saw the papers spread across the table, but she didn't hesitate in her approach. "This better be quick, Dad," she said, sliding into the chair across from me without removing her sunglasses. "I have a nail appointment at 3, and traffic's already terrible." She glanced at the documents but didn't touch them, like they might contaminate her manicure, and signaled to the barista for what I assumed was her usual complicated drink order. "We need to talk about money," I said, placing my finger on the first bank statement. "Specifically, about the money you spent on a party I wasn't allowed to attend." The words came out calmer than I felt, each syllable measured and deliberate. I'd practiced this conversation in my bathroom mirror that morning, reminding myself to stay factual, stay controlled, and let the numbers speak for themselves. She finally removed her sunglasses, and I saw something flicker behind her eyes. Not guilt exactly, but a calculating look, like she was running through possible responses and selecting the most effective one. "You owe me," she said, leaning back in her chair and lifting her chin in a gesture that reminded me uncomfortably of her mother. "All those years of child support you never paid, all the things you missed because you were drinking. This is just evening the score. Child support was handled through the court," I said, pulling out a folder of legal documents I'd retrieved from my file cabinet that morning. "Every payment made on time, in full, until you turned 18. I have the receipts." I slid the papers across the table, but she barely glanced at them, waving her hand like she was dismissing a server. "It's not about the money, Dad. It's about respect. You're outdated. Your jokes aren't funny, your clothes are embarrassing, and I don't want my friends thinking I come from some broken-down family with a drunk for a father." Each word was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut deep and leave scars. The barista called out her drink order, something with oat milk and 3 pumps of vanilla, and she rose to collect it without breaking eye contact with me. When she returned, I was holding a printed email from the restaurant. "The booking was made under 2 names," I said. "Yours and your mother's. Who told you to cut me out of your own engagement party?" She took a long sip of her drink, the foam leaving a thin line on her upper lip that she wiped away with a napkin. "Mom said it would be better for me," she said, finally looking away from me, and out the window at the afternoon traffic. She said having you there would just create drama, make people uncomfortable. She said I deserved one perfect day without having to manage your feelings. And you agreed with that? I agreed with protecting my happiness. She turned back to me, and for a moment I saw something that might have been uncertainty cross her face, but it was gone before I could be sure. This is my wedding, Dad. My day. If I want it to be special, that's my choice. I gathered the papers and slid them back into the folder, my movements slow and deliberate. It would have been special with me there too, I said. I'm your father, Sarah. That used to mean something. She stood up, slinging her purse over her shoulder with enough force to make the chain rattle. It means you write the checks, she said. That's what it's always meant. I was unlocking my truck in the parking lot when my phone rang, Linda's name appearing on the screen like a warning label. I almost let it go to voicemail. Had let it go to voicemail for the last 3 years. But something told me this call would be different. I answered on the 4th ring, not bothering with pleasantries. Don't you dare ruin this for her. Linda's voice came through the speaker sharp and commanding, the same tone she'd used when we were married, and she needed me to understand exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. No hello, no pretense of civility, just straight to the attack. I could hear classical music playing in the background, the kind of refined soundtrack she'd always preferred for her important phone calls. Ruin what, Linda? The party I already wasn't invited to? You know what I mean. Don't go filling her head with guilt about your feelings. She's planning the most important day of her life, and she doesn't need you making it about yourself. Her voice had that edge it got when she was building up to something bigger, like a storm gathering strength before it hit the coast. I leaned against my truck and watched Sarah through the coffee shop window, her phone pressed to her ear, probably getting a play-by-play of this conversation. She spent $23,000 of my money, Linda, on a party I wasn't invited to. That's not about feelings. That's about facts. She deserves more than you ever gave her, Linda said, and there was something almost triumphant in her voice, like she'd been waiting years to deliver this particular blow. All those missed recitals, all those soccer games you were too drunk to attend, all those nights she cried herself to sleep because Daddy was passed out on the couch again. This is the least you can do. The parking lot felt suddenly quiet around me, even the traffic noise seeming to fade as Linda's words settled in the air between us. I thought about those soccer games, about the recitals, about all the ways I'd failed as a father during those dark years before I got sober. But I also thought about the 5 years since then, the phone calls that went unreturned, the birthday cards that were never acknowledged, the careful distance Sarah had maintained even as she spent my money. You're right, I said, and I heard Linda's sharp intake of breath, probably surprised by the admission. I did fail her when she was young, but I've been sober for 5 years, Linda. 5 years of trying to make amends. 5 years of her taking my money while refusing to take my calls. So let me be clear about something. From now on, the money stops. If anyone touches my account again, I'll go to the police. I hung up before she could respond, and stood there in the parking lot, watching my daughter through the coffee shop window as she gestured angrily into her phone. What would you do if your own family was stealing from you while cutting you out of their lives? Let me know in the comments below. The bank branch on Maple Street opened at 9 sharp, and I was waiting in the parking lot at 8:45 with my folder of documents and a thermos of coffee that had gone cold during the drive. The morning air carried the smell of autumn leaves and car exhaust, and I watched the employees unlock the front doors with the same methodical attention I'd once brought to opening my tool shed each morning. This wasn't about anger anymore. This was about building a fence, and fences required precise measurements and solid foundations. The customer service representative was a young woman named Jessica with kind eyes and a nameplate that looked newer than her experience. She listened patiently as I explained the situation, her fingers clicking across her keyboard with practiced efficiency while I laid out bank statements across her desk like a map of financial territory that needed securing. "I need to cancel the authorized user on this account," I said, sliding Sarah's information across the desk. "And I want to change all the passwords, add two-factor authentication, and place alerts on any transaction over $50. Jessica nodded and began typing, pausing occasionally to ask for verification details or to explain what each security measure would accomplish. "We can also place a fraud alert with the credit bureaus," she said, looking up from her screen. "That means anyone trying to open new accounts in your name would need to provide additional verification." I watched her type notes into my account profile, each keystroke another brick in the wall I was building around my finances. 20 minutes later, I had a new debit card on order, confirmation numbers for fraud alerts with all 3 credit bureaus, and a printed list of every automatic payment authorized on my account. Jessica had highlighted 2 I didn't recognize: a monthly charge for some kind of subscription service and a quarterly payment to a company called Premium Events LLC that I'd never heard of. "I want those blocked immediately," I said, pointing to the highlighted entries. "And I want written confirmation that they've been canceled." Jessica made more notes, printed more forms, and handed me a business card with her direct line written on the back. "If you see any unauthorized activity going forward, call me directly," she said. "We take financial fraud very seriously and will work with you to dispute any charges you didn't approve." The folder felt heavier when I left the bank, not because of additional papers, but because of the weight of what I was really doing, cutting off my daughter's access to money she'd clearly come to see as her own. My phone started ringing before I reached my truck. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and I let it ring through to voicemail while I organized the new documents Jessica had given me. The voicemail notification appeared 30 seconds later, followed immediately by a text message. "Dad, my card isn't working. Call me now." I deleted the text without responding and drove to my next stop, the credit union where I'd opened a savings account 20 years ago and forgotten about until yesterday. The balance was modest, less than $3,000, but it represented money that Sarah and Linda didn't know existed. I asked the teller to add the same security measures I'd put on my primary account, and then I opened a new checking account with a different bank entirely, one that had no connection to any financial institution my family had ever used. "Can you set up automatic transfers from my main account to this one?" I asked the account manager, a middle-aged man named Robert, who understood the value of keeping money in different buckets. "I want to move my Social Security payments and pension deposits here, effective immediately." Robert pulled up the necessary forms and walked me through the process, explaining how long the transfers would take to process and what documentation I'd need to provide to my former employers. By noon, I had 3 bank accounts at 3 different institutions, fraud alerts on all my credit reports, and a new understanding of just how many ways money could walk out of your life without your permission. My phone had buzzed 17 times with calls and texts from Sarah, each message more urgent than the last, but I didn't read them. Instead, I drove home and made myself a sandwich, eating it slowly while I reviewed the morning's paperwork and planned my next steps. The house felt different somehow, more secure, like I'd installed new locks on all the doors. But I knew this was just the beginning. The credit report arrived in my email 48 hours later, 23 pages of my financial life laid out in neat columns and cryptic codes. I printed it at the library to avoid using ink from my home printer, a small economy that felt important after seeing how much money had disappeared from my accounts. The librarian, a woman my age with reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain, showed me to a quiet corner where I could spread the pages across a table without drawing attention. Most of the information was familiar: my mortgage, my truck payment, the credit cards I'd paid off during my first year of sobriety. But there on page 16, nestled between my utilities and my insurance payments, was an entry that made my chest tighten. Nordstrom credit account, opened 03/15/2024, current balance $2,000. I'd never set foot in a Nordstrom store in my life. The application details showed my name, my social security number, and my home address, but the contact email was listed as an address I'd never seen before, something with Sarah's name and the word style in it. The phone number was Sarah's, and the employment information listed her marketing job as my current occupation. Someone had opened a store credit account in my name, using my identity but her contact information, and they'd been using it to fund what looked like a shopping spree that had been going on for months. I took pictures of every page with my phone, then walked to the library's copier and made 2 sets of hard copies. The librarian watched me work with quiet concern, probably wondering what kind of trouble had an old man making copies of credit reports on a Tuesday afternoon. But she didn't ask questions. Back at home, I added the credit report to the growing file folder that had started with bank statements and now included vendor invoices, phone call logs, and screenshots of social media posts from the engagement party. The file was getting thick enough to tell a story that went beyond family drama and into territory that had legal implications. I opened a new document on my laptop and began typing a timeline. March 15th, 2024. Unauthorized Nordstrom account opened. March 18th, 2024. First charges appear on my debit card. April 2024. Spending increases to $500, $800 per month. Each entry was supported by documentation, each date backed up with evidence that would satisfy any investigator who might eventually need to review this case. My phone rang while I was typing. Linda's number this time. I let it go to voicemail and kept working, adding dates and amounts until I had a clear picture of how systematic this had been. This wasn't impulsive spending or family generosity gone wrong. This was identity theft, credit fraud, and financial abuse committed by people who shared my last name and seemed to think that gave them special privileges. The file folder sat on my dining room table like a loaded weapon, and I realized I was going to need to decide whether I had the courage to use it. The first sign something had changed came when my neighbor Bob stopped me while I was checking my mail. Bob had lived next door for 12 years, borrowed my tools more times than either of us could count, and never once failed to wave when he saw me working in the yard. But that Tuesday morning, he walked past his own mailbox and stood at the property line between our driveways, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, and his expression uncertain. "Hey, Jim," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Everything okay with you and Sarah? My wife saw something online that got her worried." The manila envelope in my hands felt suddenly heavy, and I could see Bob's wife Helen watching from their kitchen window, her face partially hidden behind the curtain. "What kind of something?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Bob shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the way people do when they're delivering news they'd rather not share. "She posted something about family struggles, about having to plan her wedding without support. Helen thought maybe you were sick or having money troubles." Bob's voice carried genuine concern, but there was something else underneath it. The careful distance people maintain when they're not sure which side of a story to believe. I thanked Bob and went inside, my hands shaking slightly as I opened my laptop and navigated to Sarah's social media page. The post was there, written in her carefully curated voice, accompanied by a photo of her looking pensively out a window with perfect lighting and just the right amount of vulnerability in her expression. "Sometimes the people who should support your dreams the most are the ones who let you down," she'd written. Planning the most important day of your life while dealing with family disappointment isn't easy, but it's teaching me who really cares about my happiness. The post had dozens of comments, friends and acquaintances offering sympathy and encouragement, telling her she deserved better, that some people never change. My phone buzzed with a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, Sarah's voice came through the speaker without any of the politeness she'd shown strangers at the coffee shop. "Did you see my post?" she asked, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice, like a cat that had cornered a mouse. "People are asking questions, Dad. They want to know why you're not supporting your only daughter's wedding." "I supported it to the tune of $23,000, I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "Money you spent without asking, on a party I wasn't invited to." "That's not enough," she said, and her tone shifted to something harder, more demanding. "I need another $15,000 for the remaining costs. The venue wants final payment, the photographer needs his balance, and the dress still isn't fully paid off." She paused, letting the number sink in, then continued with the casual cruelty that had become her signature move. "If you don't pay, don't dream of getting invited to the wedding. I'm done pretending you're a good father just to spare your feelings." The line went quiet, except for the sound of her breathing, waiting for my response. Through my kitchen window, I could see Bob's wife still watching from across the yard, probably wondering what kind of drama was unfolding in the house next door. Sarah had calculated this perfectly. The public pressure, the private threat, the implication that my love for her could be measured in dollar signs. "Sarah," I said finally, "I've been sober for 5 years. I've been trying to rebuild our relationship for 5 years. And in all that time, the only conversations we've had have been about money. You don't call to ask how I'm doing, you don't visit unless you need something, and you don't include me in your life unless I'm paying for it." "That's because you're embarrassing," she said, her words sharp and precise. "Your jokes are outdated, your clothes are cheap, and your opinions don't matter. The only thing you're good for is writing checks, so either write them or get out of my life completely." The call ended with a click, leaving me standing in my kitchen with a dead phone and the uncomfortable realization that my daughter had just reduced our entire relationship to a financial transaction. I looked at the social media post again, at all the supportive comments from people who only knew Sarah's version of the story, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about reputation, about truth, and about whether I was going to let them rewrite history to make me the villain in their story. The bank alert came through my phone at 3:30 in the afternoon. A notification that someone had attempted to make a large payment using my account information. I was in my garage, organizing tools that didn't need organizing, trying to keep my hands busy while my mind processed what Sarah had said during our phone call. The alert made my phone buzz against the workbench, and I saw Jessica's name from the bank displayed on the screen. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Jessica from First National," she said when I answered. "We had an attempted transaction on your account that our new security measures flagged as suspicious. Someone tried to pay a bill for $4,200 to something called Elite Wedding Services." I set down the wrench I'd been holding and walked to my kitchen table, where my folder of documents waited like a patient witness. "What kind of information did they provide?" I asked, pulling out a pen to take notes. "They had your account number and routing number, but when our system prompted for the new authentication code, they couldn't provide it. The person on the phone claimed to be your daughter and said it was an emergency payment for your family." Jessica's voice carried the professional concern of someone who'd seen this pattern before. "They became agitated when we explained we couldn't process the payment without proper verification." "Did you get any other information about the caller?" "We logged the phone number they called from, and we recorded the conversation per our standard protocol. The caller gave their name as Sarah Mitchell and claimed you'd authorized the payment but forgotten to give them the new security codes." Jessica paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "Should we flag this as attempted fraud?" I looked out my kitchen window at the roses I'd been tending for 5 years, their blooms bright against the approaching dusk. Each plant had taken time to establish, time to grow strong enough to survive winter, time to learn the difference between nurturing and neglect. "Yes," I said. "Flag it as attempted fraud, and I want a full report of the incident for my records." "We'll email you the documentation within 24 hours, Jessica said. "And Mr. Mitchell, the new security measures worked exactly as designed. Your account is safe." After I hung up, I sat at my table and added this latest incident to my timeline. October 15th, attempted unauthorized payment to Elite Wedding Services, $4,200. Caller identified as Sarah Mitchell. Transaction declined due to security protocols. The pattern was becoming clearer with each entry. They weren't just spending my money, they were systematically trying to access my accounts, even after I'd changed all the security measures. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This isn't over, Dad. You're making a huge mistake." I deleted the text and added a note to my file. They were getting desperate, and desperate people make dangerous choices. The police station smelled like coffee and disinfectant, with fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead and cast everything in harsh, unforgiving clarity. I'd driven past this building 1,000 times in 20 years, but never had reason to walk through its doors until now. The file folder under my arm felt heavier than its actual weight, thick with documentation that told a story I'd never imagined having to tell. At the front desk, a young officer with sergeant stripes looked up from his computer screen. "I need to file a report for identity theft and credit card fraud," I said, sliding my driver's license across the counter. The sergeant's expression shifted from routine politeness to professional attention, and he gestured toward a row of plastic chairs. "Detective Morrison handles financial crimes," he said. "She'll be with you in a few minutes." The waiting area was occupied by 2 other people, a woman clutching a purse with white knuckles, and a man in work clothes who kept checking his phone. Neither of them looked at me, and I was grateful for the anonymity. Detective Morrison appeared after 10 minutes, a woman in her mid-40s with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. She wore a practical blazer over dark slacks and moved with the efficient purpose of someone who measured time in case files and court dates. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Detective Morrison. Let's go to my office." She led me through a maze of cubicles and file cabinets to a small room with a metal desk, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out on the parking lot where I'd left my truck. The walls were bare except for a calendar and a whiteboard covered in case numbers and dates. I opened my folder and laid out the contents methodically. Bank statements, credit reports, vendor invoices, phone call logs, screenshots of social media posts. Detective Morrison watched without comment, her fingers steepled under her chin, as I arranged the evidence in chronological order. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of papers rustling and the distant hum of office conversation. "Walk me through it," she said, when I finished organizing the documents. Her voice was neutral, professional, giving away nothing about what she was thinking. "I did not authorize anyone to use my account," I said, pointing to the bank statements. "Over the past 6 months, someone has been using my debit card information and opened credit accounts in my name. They used this money to pay for an engagement party that I was deliberately excluded from attending." I kept my voice steady and factual, letting the paperwork speak for itself. Detective Morrison picked up the credit report and examined the Nordstrom account entry, then cross-referenced it with the bank statements showing corresponding charges. These transactions were made by family members? My daughter and my ex-wife. The vendors confirmed that both women made bookings and provided my payment information. I handed her the notes I'd taken during my phone calls with the restaurant, florist, and photographer. I have recordings of some of these conversations if you need them. She spent 20 minutes reviewing each document, making notes on a legal pad, asking clarifying questions about dates and amounts. When she reached the bank alert about the attempted elite wedding services payment, she looked up with something that might have been sympathy. "This is systematic," she said. "Identity theft, credit fraud, unauthorized use of banking instruments. The dollar amounts put this in felony territory." She gathered the papers into a neat stack and looked at me directly. "Are you prepared to pursue criminal charges against family members?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be put out. Through the window, I could see people walking to their cars, going about their ordinary lives, probably never having to decide whether to have their own family members arrested. "Yes," I said. "I am." 3 weeks later, Detective Morrison called me at home while I was watering my roses in the early morning cool. Her voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd solved a puzzle that had been bothering her. "We've completed our investigation," she said. "The bank provided transaction records, and we interviewed the vendors you identified. The pattern is clear. Your ex-wife initiated most of the bookings and provided your financial information, while your daughter handled the follow-up payments and account management." I set down the watering can and sat on my wooden bench, the phone pressed to my ear. "What happens now?" "Linda Mitchell has been charged with identity theft and fraudulent use of a financial instrument. Both are felonies in this state. Your daughter's case is more complicated. She used authorized access that was later revoked, but she also participated in the Nordstrom account opening, which constitutes identity fraud." Detective Morrison paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "We'll be calling her in for questioning this afternoon." The call came from Sarah 2 hours later, her voice higher and more strained than I'd ever heard it. "Dad, the police just called me. They want me to come in for an interview about some kind of fraud investigation. What did you do?" "I reported the unauthorized use of my accounts," I said, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded. "The same unauthorized use we discussed at the coffee shop, the same pattern of spending that's been going on for months. You called the police on your own family." The disbelief in her voice was genuine, like she couldn't comprehend that actions might have consequences. "Over money? Over a few wedding expenses?" "Over $23,000 in unauthorized charges," I corrected. "And over a credit account opened in my name without my knowledge. Sarah, identity theft is a felony. Credit fraud is a felony. These aren't a few wedding expenses." The silence stretched long enough that I thought she might have hung up. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, uncertain in a way I hadn't heard since she was a child. "They said Mom was the primary contact for most of the vendors. They said she's been charged already." "Yes. I didn't know she was opening accounts in your name. I swear I didn't know about the Nordstrom thing." For the first time in our conversation, Sarah sounded like she was telling the truth. "She just told me the money was available, that you'd approved everything, that it was your contribution to the wedding." I looked across my yard at the roses I'd been tending for 5 years, their blooms bright and healthy despite all the storms they'd weathered. "Sarah, you spent my money on a party I wasn't invited to. Even if your mother arranged it, you knew I wasn't there. You knew I hadn't been consulted." "I thought you deserved to be excluded," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I thought you'd ruined enough family occasions with your drinking, your problems, your drama. Mom said it was time to have one perfect day, without worrying about you." The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. After 5 years of sobriety, 5 years of trying to make amends, my daughter had still seen me as the drunk who'd missed her soccer games, rather than the father who'd been trying to rebuild their relationship. "The detective will want to know exactly what your mother told you," I said. "And Sarah? Tell her the truth. All of it." She hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me alone with my roses and the uncomfortable knowledge that sometimes justice and family reconciliation were incompatible goals. 2 days later, Detective Morrison called with an update that would change everything. The doorbell rang at 7:15 on a Thursday evening, just as I was settling in with the newspaper and a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm. I wasn't expecting anyone, hadn't been expecting anyone for months, really, since most of my social interactions happened at the hardware store or the weekly AA meetings downtown. Through the front window, I could see a figure on my porch, but the evening shadows made it difficult to identify who was standing there. When I opened the door, Sarah was leaning against the porch railing, her arms wrapped around herself, like she was cold despite the mild October weather. She wasn't wearing any of the expensive clothes I'd grown accustomed to seeing. No designer blazers, no jewelry that caught the light, no perfectly styled hair. Instead, she had on a plain gray sweater that looked like it had come from a discount store, jeans with actual wear marks at the knees, and sneakers that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face was scrubbed clean of the heavy makeup that usually painted her features into something approaching perfection. "Dad," she said, and the word came out like she wasn't sure she had the right to use it anymore. She looked smaller somehow, younger, like the successful marketing professional had been stripped away to reveal the uncertain girl underneath. Her hands were shaking slightly as she reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope that looked suspiciously familiar. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside without saying anything, watching as she walked into my living room and looked around like she was seeing it for the first time. She sat on the edge of my couch, the envelope clutched in her lap, and stared at her hands for a long moment before speaking. "I printed out all the text messages," she said, her voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "The ones from Mom, the ones between us, the email chains about the wedding planning, all of it." She opened the envelope and pulled out a thick stack of papers, each page dense with screenshots of conversations I'd never been part of. I wanted to see the whole picture, the timeline of how this all started. I sat in my recliner across from her, the same chair where I'd read the morning paper for 15 years, and waited for her to continue. The silence stretched between us, filled with the sound of the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and the distant noise of traffic on Maple Street. "She started working on me in January," Sarah said, flipping through the papers like she was reading evidence at a trial. "Right after you and I had that phone call about meeting my fiancé. She said it was time to set boundaries with your father, that I needed to protect my special day from his dysfunction." She looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen in years, uncertainty mixed with what might have been guilt. "She had it all planned out. Cut you out of the engagement party, but keep using your money. Make it look like you were choosing not to participate rather than being excluded. She said it was strategic family management, that it would teach you to respect my independence." Sarah's hands were steady now as she sorted through the screenshots, organizing them by date, like she was building a case against her own mother. "And I believed her," she continued, her voice getting stronger. "I believed her when she said you were still the same person who missed my soccer games, who chose alcohol over family dinners, who made every special occasion about your problems instead of celebrating me. She said leopards don't change their spots. That 5 years of sobriety was just you trying to manipulate your way back into our lives. I watched my daughter sit there with the evidence of manipulation spread across her lap, and something loosened in my chest that had been tight for months. This wasn't the same person who'd demanded money and threatened to exclude me from her wedding. This was someone who'd been awakened to the possibility that she'd been played. "Mom's been arrested," she said finally. "The detective called me yesterday with an update. They found more accounts opened in your name, charges going back to last year. She's looking at serious jail time." Sarah folded one of the printed emails and creased it carefully, her movements precise and deliberate. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm sorry I believed her. I'm sorry I spent your money, and I'm sorry I excluded you from something that should have included you." The apology hung in the air between us, simple and clean, without the drama or elaborate explanations I might have expected. I got up from my chair and walked to the kitchen, returning with a yellow legal pad and a pen, the same tools I'd used to document the financial fraud that had brought us to this moment. Sarah watched as I sat back down and wrote "father-daughter relationship terms" at the top of the page, my handwriting careful and precise. "If we're going to rebuild this," I said, "we need clear boundaries, rules that both of us understand and agree to follow." I clicked the pen and looked at her directly. "This isn't about punishment, Sarah. This is about respect and trust, and those things require structure." She nodded, her expression serious in a way I hadn't seen since she was a teenager asking to borrow the car for the first time. "What kind of rules?" "First, respect," I said, writing the word and underlining it. "No more attacks on my character. No more social media posts designed to make me look like a bad father. No more allowing other people to speak for me or make decisions about me without my input." I paused, waiting for her to object, but she just sat there listening. "Second, financial transparency. If you need money for wedding expenses or anything else, you ask me directly, with specific amounts and specific purposes. No more authorized user privileges, no more assumptions that my money is automatically available for your use." Another line on the legal pad, another boundary drawn in ink that wouldn't fade. "Third, any expense you want me to cover goes through a formal process. You send me an invoice with your name on it, from a vendor I can verify, for an amount we've agreed on in advance. No more surprise charges, no more third-party bookings, no more financial decisions made behind my back." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing what I'd said. "And fourth, no one makes decisions about my role in your life except you and me. Your mother doesn't get a vote, your friends don't get to influence whether I'm included in family events, and your future husband gets consulted but doesn't get veto power." I set the pen down and looked at her. "These aren't negotiable, Sarah. They're the minimum requirements for us to have any kind of relationship going forward." She reached for the legal pad and read through my handwritten list, her lips moving silently as she processed each condition. "These seem fair," she said finally. "More than fair, considering what I've put you through. Are you willing to follow them?" "Yes." The word came out without hesitation, and I felt something shift in the room, like a door opening after being locked for too long. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator and pantry with familiar efficiency. "Stay for dinner," I said, not making it a question this time. "I'm making meatballs in tomato sauce, and there's enough for 2 people." While the sauce simmered, I set the table with care. 2 plates, 2 sets of silverware, 2 glasses for water, and 2 cloth napkins I rarely used. At Sarah's place, I put a small index card with her name, written in my careful handwriting, the same way I'd written place cards for family dinners when she was little. The courthouse on 5th Street looked the same as it had 27 years ago when Linda and I had walked up those same stone steps to get married. Imposing columns, heavy wooden doors, and the kind of architectural weight that made everyone who entered speak in hushed tones. This time, I was here alone, carrying the same manila folder that had started this whole process, waiting to see how the legal system would handle what Detective Morrison had called a clear-cut case of identity theft and financial fraud. I sat in the back row of the courtroom, watching as Linda was led to the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit that made her look smaller and older than I remembered. Her hair was pulled back severely, and she kept her eyes fixed on her hands, which were folded in her lap like she was praying. The public defender assigned to her case looked tired and overworked, shuffling through papers with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd handled too many similar cases. "The state versus Linda Michelle Mitchell," the clerk announced, her voice carrying across the nearly empty courtroom. "Charges of identity theft in the 2nd degree, fraudulent use of a financial instrument, and conspiracy to commit fraud." The prosecutor, a young woman who couldn't have been much older than Sarah, laid out the evidence with clinical precision. Unauthorized credit accounts, falsified applications, a pattern of financial abuse spanning nearly a year. She spoke about dollar amounts and legal definitions, reducing months of family betrayal into neat categories that fit within existing criminal statutes. Linda's attorney argued for leniency, citing her clean record and claiming the actions were motivated by a desire to help her daughter rather than personal gain. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said during her rebuttal, "the defendant systematically exploited her access to the victim's personal information to fund lifestyle choices and family events to the tune of over $30,000. The fact that the victim is her ex-husband doesn't diminish the severity of these crimes." She gestured toward the evidence table, where my bank statements and credit reports were neatly organized in clear plastic folders. The judge, a gray-haired woman who looked like she'd seen every possible variation of human stupidity, listened to both sides before imposing sentence. "Ms. Mitchell, you'll serve 18 months in the county facility, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. You're ordered to pay full restitution to the victim, and you're prohibited from any contact with him during the probation period." The gavel came down with a sound like a door closing. I didn't feel satisfaction or vindication as Linda was led away in handcuffs. I felt tired, like I'd been holding my breath for months and could finally exhale. This wasn't about revenge or getting even. It was about consequences, about drawing lines that meant something, about proving that some behaviors were unacceptable regardless of family relationships. Outside the courthouse, Detective Morrison found me on the steps, her badge gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. "How are you holding up?" she asked, genuine concern in her voice. "I'm okay," I said. And I meant it. It needed to be done. For what it's worth, you did the right thing. Financial abuse is still abuse, even when it's family doing it. She handed me a business card with her direct number written on the back. "Call me if there are any more problems. And Mr. Mitchell, you might want to consider keeping those security measures on your accounts permanently." I drove home slowly, taking the long way through downtown and past the park where I used to take Sarah when she was little. I didn't post about the court proceedings on social media, didn't call anyone to share the news, didn't take pictures of the sentencing documents. Some victories were meant to be private, measured not in public validation, but in the quiet knowledge that you'd stood up for yourself when it mattered. 3 weeks after the sentencing, I was in my kitchen cleaning up after dinner when I heard 2 soft knocks on my front door. Not the confident knocking of someone who expected to be welcomed, but the tentative tapping of someone who wasn't sure they belonged there. Through the window, I could see Sarah standing on my porch, her posture uncertain in a way that reminded me of the night she'd first come to apologize. She was wearing the same plain sweater she'd worn that evening, paired with jeans that had honest dirt stains from what looked like actual work. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her face was free of the heavy makeup that had become her trademark. When I opened the door, she held up a small white bag that smelled like fresh bread. "I brought dinner rolls," she said. "The kind you used to like from Peterson's bakery. I thought maybe we could have dinner together again, if that's okay." I stepped aside to let her in, noting how she wiped her feet carefully on the mat and hung her jacket on the hook by the door. Small gestures of respect that would have seemed insignificant a year ago, but now carried weight. She followed me to the kitchen, where I'd already started preparing my usual Thursday night meal of meatballs and tomato sauce. "Can I help with anything?" she asked, washing her hands at the sink without being asked. I handed her the task of making a salad, and we worked together in comfortable silence, the kind of quiet companionship I remembered from years before everything went wrong. As we moved around my small kitchen, I noticed she kept pulling at her fingernails, and it took me a moment to realize what was different. The elaborate acrylics she'd worn for months were gone, replaced by her natural nails trimmed short and painted with clear polish. She caught me looking and held up her hands with a self-conscious smile. "I took them off last week," she said. "They were expensive, and honestly, they made it hard to do anything useful with my hands." She bent one finger experimentally, like she was rediscovering how her hands were supposed to work. "I've been helping pack up Mom's apartment. The landlord wants everything out by the end of the month." We sat at my dining room table with our plates of food and her fresh dinner rolls, and for the first time in years, Sarah put her phone face down on the table instead of keeping it within easy reach. The gesture was small, but it felt significant. A conscious choice to be present instead of partially somewhere else. "I have something to ask you," she said, tearing a roll into small pieces instead of eating it. "My fiancé, David, he wants to meet you, properly, I mean. Not just a quick introduction, but dinner, conversation, the chance to actually get to know each other." She looked up from the breadcrumbs scattered around her plate. "Would you be willing to do that?" I reached across this table and moved her chair slightly closer, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that echoed in the quiet room. "I'd like that very much," I said. Sarah nodded and finally took a bite of the roll she'd been destroying. "Good, because I told him all about the meatballs and he's been wanting to try your recipe." She smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like the little girl who used to help me cook on Sunday afternoons. We ate the rest of our dinner in comfortable quiet, and when Sarah finally picked up her phone to check the time, she immediately put it back down. "This is nice," she said. "Just sitting here, eating real food, not worrying about taking pictures or posting updates. Just being here." It was enough to begin again. What would you have done in my situation? Family relationships are complicated, but respect and boundaries matter at every age. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life drama that proves truth really is stranger than fiction.